You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Faith and Other Oddities. We're glad to be here. As we wrapped up last time, David was getting kicked out of the king's court in Gath.
Yeah, and we kind of wrapped up with looking at how the story at Gath and the story of Nov played together. And we're going to look at a psalm that talks about this time. What I found interesting is the psalm actually confirms how the stories play together, but it does so through what is probably a scribal error. So I found this just to be fascinating. So one of the things we're going to be doing as we go through the rest of David's story is we're going to try to pull in the Psalms where they're appropriate so that we can see how they play off the story and maybe enlighten us a little bit about to what's going on within Samuel and the Book of Kings. So it's a lot of fun because it does change how you read the Psalm. And I was surprised at how much more impact this psalm had for me personally as I read through it in connection with David. And, that's one of the dangers of doing any kind of Bible study is, even though I'm, quote, doing it for a working reason, is, occasionally you just get smacked upside the head with what the Bible has to say to you personally.
Oh, yeah. When I was working for the company writing those sermon outlines, oh, man, there was so much stuff that you come across. I mean, and it's like anytime you are teaching something, you're learning. If you're doing it right.
Hopefully. And, and I really don't think you can teach something you haven't learned. I mean, you can speculate and talk around it, but
you can regurgitate things you haven't learned, but you can't really teach them. So
yeah.
And what psalm number were we in
We
again?
are in Psalm 34.
34, okay.
And so I want to talk a little bit about how the Psalms are set up before we get really into the Psalm, because
because we haven't done a whole lot of work. We've mentioned some Psalms, but we haven't done like a seriously focused episode on a psalm.
Yeah. Now, psalms, there's several different kinds of psalms. There's teaching psalms, there's acrostic psalms, there's thanksgiving psalms, there's psalms of ascent. And each psalm is used for a specific kind of purpose, and they're read at various holidays. This one actually is read at Rosh Chodesh. So we have that connection back to that, which I thought was interesting. But we'll talk about each psalm as we go through it, and what style of psalm it is, so we don't just go down a list of this is what an acrostic psalm is for, and this is what
Sure.
That way hopefully a little bit more interesting. This one in particular is an acrostic psalm, and so we're going to talk more about that as we get through it. So we'll start with the superscription. The superscription, yeah, isn't that a fun descriptor there? That's the title that you have at the beginning of a psalm.
Right.
So this psalm...
I forgot what they were called for a second.
Yeah.
Like, I know I've heard the term, but it sounds funny when it's said out loud. I almost never hear it said out loud. I read it at times, but yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and what their purpose is to tell you who wrote the psalm, what specific event it was written for, how it's supposed to be used. Sometimes they'll tell you what instruments should be used with the psalm. And so these kind of give you some descriptors. Now, this one begins with of David when he changed his behavior before Abimelech so that he drove him out and went away. Now, David did not change his behavior before Abimelech, and as a matter of fact, Abimelech isn't even anywhere in the story.
Yeah, it was Achish.
Yes, and so we have to figure out what the psalm could be talking about. Now, the proposed solutions are that simply the writer of the superscription, which was added after the psalm was written, confused the two men. He confused Ahimelech and Achish, but we still have this problem because it's not Ahimelech in the psalm superscription that's named, it's Abimelech. And so there's also the possibility that the Ahim and the Abem were the way it was spelled. It was just a misspelling there. The third possibility is that Abimelech is the title of the kings of the Philistines. So,
And you said this is in Psalm 34, the super, because
yeah.
mine doesn't say that.
Oh, really? Because mine does. Of David when he changed his behavior before Abimelech.
No, mine doesn't say that at all.
Huh. What's your say?
Psalm 34, right? 34, 3-4. It says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." Oh,
Right.
there it is. It's in the verse. Okay.
Yeah, and that's another thing. When you look at different Bibles, some Bibles will put the title or that superscription as verse 1.
Yeah, and I was also on a different psalm before. I was in 43 before, so that helped
No, I get that. We both do that.
transpose the numbers.
Yes, and then some psalms, some translations will put the superscription as a title above the first verse. So sometimes lining up the verses and trying to find the same verse can be interesting. Probably in that one, and I'm taking a guess here, the superscription is going to be the first verse.
It is in this.
Yeah.
And it's the first verse in my ESV too.
Okay, so on my ESV, which is newer, it's not.
Huh.
So yeah. So but yeah, so the idea that Abimelech, sorry, would be the title, like Pharaoh is the title of all the kings in Egypt. So Abimelech would have been the title of the king of the Philistines, which then it would apply to Achish, and it would be completely correct. So it's not really that big of a confusion here. So I think we have several possibilities that line it out nicely. And before we get into the psalm itself, one of the things we want to talk about there's this story, and I think it's a great story. It's not in scripture; it is completely extra biblical. But there's a story that David was talking to God about the beauty of creation, and he told God how he could see beauty in all creation. He could find God's design and purpose and redemptive power in all that he saw around him. The only thing he couldn't find beauty in was madness, that he could see no beauty, no purpose in it. And God tells David that one day he will pray for madness because he will have need of it. So this is the psalm that David wrote to thank God, traditionally, to thank God for the madness that he was able to put on display in Gath. So, like I said, this psalm is an acrostic. So there's a verse for every letter of the Hebrew alphabet. There's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. The only exception is Vav, and that might be actually found in the middle of verse 6. But the problem is, if we say that is for Vav, then there's only one line of poetry for the Hey and one for Vav, where all the other letters get 2 lines. Now, we've had other acrostic poems that we can talk about that we'd actually, one of them was missing the mem. And we've actually, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found the mem, and a lot of your ESV translations will include that. I can't remember the number.
Is that
right
119?
I think it is 119.
Because that's the one that's known for being like the large acrostic.
I believe you are correct. So, and a lot of times, even if your Bible doesn't have it, they'll put it in a footnote just so you can see how, that there is something for that place. Acrostic poems are written specifically to help with memorization, and they would be written with great care about their theological messaging. You would not create something for someone to memorize about God that was not specifically crafted to reflect the truth about God. So, this isn't sloppy songwriting. This is actually very tight, very concise, very well executed kind of writing. And so the idea that even in your songs of praise and thanksgiving, which this is also a Thanksgiving psalm, it crosses those boundaries. But in that Thanksgiving, you should be very careful with the theology you present. It's very apparent, and we should learn from that in the Psalms here. So just because something sounds good in a song doesn't mean it needs to be written, particularly when we're talking about God. So with the superscription, there is a great deal of debates on these just in general, not just concerning this one in particular. Were they part of the actual psalm? Were they added later? Who added them? Was the person who added them actually attributing them to the right moment in David's life?
Mhm.
Um, we don't know. I tend to lean towards the idea that whoever wrote them had very good reason to put them with the Psalms that they did. And what this does is gives us a historical framework through which to view and interpret the theological messagings of the Psalms. So also, if you view the superscriptions as part of the psalm, it kind of reinforces that artistry of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so these psalms were not just written about specific instances; they were written to be sung during specific instances. And despite the specific,
Specificity?
yes, that's the word I was trying to go for. They do have a universal application. So we want to be able to hold the two things in tension, that it can be speaking of a specific moment, but we can also see that the principles can be drawn out and applied today. So according to my Bible, this is verse 1. Having passed through this ordeal with Saul, having been humiliated, I'm sorry, sorry, let me read the verse. That's what I was going to do.
Hmm.
Um,
It's always a good idea.
Yeah.
When in doubt.
I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. So the commentators, and I'm going with mostly Jewish commentators from the Art Scroll book on Psalms. This is the reason, because they knew the culture, but they said that having passed through his ordeal with Saul and having been humiliated by having to pose as a madman, David vows to bless the Lord at all times. And so this is his vow for praise and worship to become a consistent way of life. Now, we have reason to believe that he did this before when he confronts Saul before he goes to Goliath. He talks about his thankfulness for God's power and authority to save him from the bear and the lion. But the rabbis say this marks a shift in David's life when he goes from it being just something he does when something great happens to actually realizing that praise and worship is valuable even in the most humiliating of times.
Mhm.
So in verse 2, we have this line that says, "Let the humble hear and be glad." We're going to hear more about the humble in David's life when we get to chapter 22 of 1 Samuel, but we're going to find out that the humble, the marginalized, the ones who don't fit in proper society, they're drawn to David.
Mhm.
They love him, and the humble on a universal level are people who can't help themselves. There's people who don't have a way out of their current situation. They need to know that God can deliver, God can save, God is faithful to do so. And David's saying, look at what he's done for me. He can do it for you. And
Right.
this is why they hear and they be glad. But in this gladness, they're doing more than just praising God. They are joining together to create a community. And these humble that join David are actually going to be the basis of David's reign. They're going to make up David's royal courts. And there is a full reversal of social circumstance under David's reign that I sometimes think we forget. And we forget that he brings these people who were nobodies,
Mhm.
and he makes them the most important leading citizens of the kingdom. But when they join together here in the psalm to praise, they're saying that we're accepting the one who was in crisis back into our community, but we're also saying that we are a part of this community, and that the community is formed by those who have been in crisis, those who have been delivered by crisis, and maybe those who are still in crisis. So verse 5, and I did skip some because I think they're kind of self-explanatory.
Mhm.
And like I said, there's several lines here, so I didn't want to spend all day on this one. But verse 5 says, "Those who look at him," and he's talking about God, "are radiant." And we're supposed to be reminded of Moses when he comes down from Sinai and he'd spent so much time with God that his face glowed and he had to cover his face with a veil so that people could even look at him. And well, David is saying, those who see God in their everyday circumstances, in the humiliation and the hard times of this life, have that same opportunity to be radiant. Maybe not, literally as Moses was, but spiritually, emotionally, mentally, that they can radiate God's goodness back to them. Now, if you remember our discussion on Rosh Kodesh, you began to see how this psalm plays into those themes of Rosh Kodesh, because the moon does not shine with its own light. It radiates with the light of the sun being reflected from it. So, verse 6, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. So, we have a little bit of supernatural flavor starting to pop up here. And this is an echo of that wilderness journey. You're going to find a lot of Psalms are going to refer back to Genesis. They're going to refer back to Exodus. David very much sees himself in line with this heritage where he is replaying these events that help form the nation. Now these events are happening to him in a kind of a microcosm, and they're helping form and shape him as a person, just like those wilderness journeys help shape and form the nation of Israel into a cohesive community and really set them apart. They weren't Egyptians. They weren't going to be confused for Canaanites. They were a distinct nation. And now David is part of this distinct nation. And as such, he has the right to expect God's protection in the form of the angel of the Lord who is with them in those wilderness journeys. And we know that this angel of the Lord stayed with them up until Judges 2. And that's where God says, no, done. And the angel of the Lord withdraws. So David is saying that there's a way to reclaim this kind of intimate relationship that Israel once had, where God was present in their midst. So there's a lot packed in here that, unless you know the stories, the Psalms don't have the depth that they could.
Yeah, and I do think it's interesting, because we did talk about that as we were going through Genesis. Is it Genesis or no, Judges? Because we mentioned the Judges thing. We talked about the angel of the Lord living with the Israelites, like he camped with them.
Yeah,
and we see this, and then we see again when we get to John
mm-hmm.
that if we assume the angel of the Lord is the pre-incarnate Jesus,
mm-hmm.
then we look at that and we go, that language there is that he came to earth, he encamped, he struck a tent.
Yeah,
is the word.
Yeah, he actually it means he tabernacled with them.
Yeah, he lived in a tent with us, and so which would be you encamp, and so I thought that's kind of an interesting connection there.
Yeah, and think about how radical this is, because for us, the idea that God is with us, that the Holy Spirit accompanies us, these are kind of givens of the Christian faith. But in Judaism, particularly at this time, you didn't have that same individual, personal, intimate relationship. It was God dealing with the entire nation. And yeah, you had a few people here and there, but David's promise, I mean, this isn't just for himself. He's promising it for everyone who is with him. And those who look, that's plural. So the idea that God would actually deign to be with not just Saul, the king who reigns from his throne, but these humble people who surround David, this is huge. This is a radical shift in ideology. So I'm going to skip down to verse 8, and it says, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good." And I think a lot of us have seen this, hanging in somebody's kitchen. I know I have. But this is an invitation to see and to experience God's beauty in creation, and as it reveals the beauty of the Creator. Not that the creation should be worshipped, but the Creator who would care to give us so many good things. And I'm thinking of the scripture when Jesus says, if a child asks for bread, does he get a stone? It's
well, and see, my connection whenever I think of this verse, what I always think of is, you mentioned like when you're teaching children Torah, when they say something or learn something from Torah, you reward them by giving them honey.
Yes.
And that's where this connection to me comes in.
And there is definitely that connection there. And that is part of the idea of when you teach Torah, that you teach God's word is sweet. And that's the reason why you give honey. And the idea that the senses can be elevated and you can find enjoyment through your senses is something very unique to this time period. We're moving into a place where a lot of the times when you read through the Torah and you read through a lot of the stories, it's almost like the senses are bad. And I know a lot of Christians who have this idea. One of the accusations thrown against me was I'm too sensual because I like the things that make my senses, that excite my senses. And this is we're talking like a sunset. We're talking that full moon. We're talking good food. I mean, if y'all guys haven't picked up, we like good food here.
We like good food.
So, and there's this idea that we as Christians and we as followers of God shouldn't enjoy these things because we're just supposed to be in suffering and misery all the day long. But we forget that God created some of these things for us to enjoy and to enjoy very much. Matter of fact, I love in the Jerusalem Talmud, there's this teaching that you should seek out new foods just to eat them so that you can try them and see what God has given the world to enjoy.
I can get behind that.
I'm with you. But beyond just enjoying God's creation, eating is something you do in community. It's again that call to return to community and to appreciate what God's creation together and to have this unity. And remember how many of the sacrifices, they didn't just go give them to the temple and walk off. They stayed and they ate with their families. I mean, go back to
that's something I didn't know until a couple years ago.
I don't doubt it.
The sacrifice was a communal meal.
Right.
Because I had always been told that you throw it on the altar and it burns up. And then you have the pastors who, I think I may have mentioned this on the show before, but I think it's, everyone's probably heard at some point in their life, we're called to be living sacrifices. And the problem with the living sacrifice is it wants to crawl off the altar.
Right.
Well, the sacrifice was never meant to stay on the altar.
Right. Certain parts. No.
But there were parts of the sacrifice that were supposed to go back out and nourish the community.
Exactly.
That we aren't just supposed to sit on the altar waiting for Jesus to come back, not interacting, not helping people, not improving our community and our relationships and our families.
Well, and take that a step further. If you don't put anything up there as a sacrifice, what are you going to eat? You only get fed when you're willing to sacrifice. That's another part of that. But the priest who took too much, Eli and Phinehas and Hophni, God had a problem with them. Yeah. God killed them. So it's the idea that you don't take what you don't deserve, but you should joyfully receive what God said should return to you.
Sure.
And it isn't, I gave everything up for the Lord. I mean, really?
Yeah, we see where that attitude gets you an axe.
Yeah, that's... Maybe we'll get there one day. So we're going to skip down to verse 10. The lions suffer but hunger, and those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. Now, this is an interesting verse, but again, you've got to have context. The context here is in ancient Near Eastern culture, lions were often represented as the powerful fool and the one who did not revere God. So you contrast this. This is not the roaring lion seeking who the roaring lion who's seeking who he can devour. This is the lion who is starving because he is completely dependent on his own ability. And David points to hunger that results from self-sufficiency and arrogance. And, fear of the Lord, the dependence on the Lord, desire for the Lord. This is what gets you to that place where you don't lack anything. And I don't even think he's talking about material well-being. I mean, because right now, while David's writing this, he's on the run from Saul. He didn't even have a sword. And so here's this guy who's talking about not lacking anything. What the heck? I mean, is he just delusional, or does he recognize that God really will provide if we just hold on? Because now we're seeing how the psalm, it's not somebody who's just doing okay, telling everybody else, "Buck up, buddy, you
Well,
can do it."
and it's really interesting that the line is, "Those who fear the Lord lack nothing."
Yeah,
Okay, you were just mentioned that he was without a sword, but it didn't really seem like he was being terribly fearful when he went and got the sword.
exactly.
So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and we're gonna go through this kind of this reversal that's going on with David through this psalm. So we'll get there. So verse 11, he says, "I will teach you the fear of the Lord." Now, this is kind of an interesting idea, to be taught the fear of the Lord. Um, there is this aspect, a lot of times we talk about the fear of the Lord, that there's this great big God up in heaven who's just waiting to punish you for his sin. I had a friend who used to hang out with me and said she kept waiting for lightning to strike every time we were around each other. This was a time when I was really, really questioning God. But that was her view of God, that God was just, I was going to be struck by lightning for daring to question. But the focus on this is awe. It's not fear as in I just God's going to kill me if I do something wrong. It's he's so much greater and beyond my comprehension that the only thing I can do is be in awe of him.
Mm.
And it has to be taught. It has to be, and I think that's what interests me the most. That it's not something that we come to naturally. I think that if in our own power, we just get to that place of fear of punishment. But when we have somebody walk alongside us and show us the way that God has demonstrated his love through these good things, through these things we can enjoy with our senses, now we can move past that place of, paralyzed trembling and actually be in awe of a God who loves us and a God who is holy and has those two attributes operating in tension.
Right.
And so, the rabbis taught that fear of punishment is actually very self-defeating because it removes the reward for obedience,
Yeah.
and it actually leads to bitterness and anger and frustration. And I think we all know people who
Well, and we see that in the parable of the talents.
we
I
do.
mean, we see it. I mean, that's such a great teaching, and Tim
Mhm.
Mackey does a fantastic sermon on that.
It's-
We'll put that in the show notes. It's great because it's so much. There's so much more to that story than what we were taught growing up.
Usually is. I mean,
Well, I mean, yeah, that's kind of the theme of the show, and if we're not covering it, and we know someone who is, we'll try to get you there.
absolutely, absolutely. Kind of a side note, I was talking to somebody, actually it was Linda, she's in our paddle store too. Talking to her earlier this week, and you know, one of the things that I really hope is that people outgrow us. That at some point what we're offering is so simplistic to them that they don't even they want to go to somebody who teaches more in depth,
Mhm.
and so that's kind of where I think we should all be as Christian teachers
Mhm,
and people
mhm.
who share. I want people who hear what I'm saying to outgrow us at some point, and because that means I'm doing my job well.
Right,
And
right.
so, but this idea of being taught to fear, it is it's so huge because the focus is on the fact that God deserves the awe, and we aren't going to be ruled by human perception. That our perceptions of God are defined by what's revealed about Him in the Torah.
Mhm.
So,
I and I'm I'm looking at the two different translations here. I've
uh-huh.
got the JPS and I've got the ESV, and I find the wording on these things to be subtly interesting. The way
Which one are
they've
you looking
chosen
at?
to translate it, and it's the "Come, listen, I'll teach you what the fear of the Lord is." And in this one, it's verse 13 in the JPS, but I think it's 12 in the
Hmm.
ESV. It says, "Who is the man who is eager for life, who desires years of good fortune?" Okay.
Hmm.
And 12's what man is there who desires life and loves many days that he may see good? So, a little couple little subtle things.
Hmm.
what man is there versus who is the man.
Right.
One of them sounds like there's not a man who desires life and to see good.
Keep talking.
The other one, the other part of that is to seek life and see goodness. But this one says, what does this say? Who desires years of good fortune. And that's a very
Very different
way, especially when you tack on all of the baggage of the way that the church defines good versus good fortune. Though, I mean, just
Yes.
the contrast between the way these two are translated to me is staggering.
Yeah, because okay, now I'm looking at the Hebrew here, and it is me who Haish, the man who desires Chayam, uh, and loves many days that he may they wrote see good. So good fortune is not in there. Fortune has nothing to do with that.
Well, that's interesting because the good fortune is in the JPS.
Okay, now sometimes the JPS can actually have um, a little bit more liberal slant to it. Now, the ESV, I will have to say, despite some of the problems I've mentioned before, they do a very good job at word for word translation
Right.
most of the time. However, I did find a discrepancy in one of the future Psalms. So we'll talk about that.
Okay.
But it is good. The Masoretic text says Tov, to see Tov.
Okay.
They wrote, sorry. I shouldn't try to do this on the fly.
Sure. No,
but-
I get it. Yeah. Well, and then later, farther down, like the JPS says seek integrity. The
Mhm.
ESV says seek peace.
Yeah, totally different.
So it's just
well,
it's interesting because
peace and integrity, I get that because peace in Hebrew, shalom,
is wholeness.
wholeness.
Yeah.
So that kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
But then you lose the connections.
Right.
And so that's the reason why we need to be careful with our translations. Yeah, the verse 12, who is the man that there, what man is there, or who is the man that desires life and loves many days that he may see good? A man with the ability to see God at work within creation, no matter what his circumstances, will love life.
Yeah.
He'll
But, and I love that this is like, who's the man who seeks good, then gives you a description. And then this one says, what man is there?
Yeah.
It kind of,
Well, but
I
now
know.
we're going back to the total depravity, and
I know that this has a very Calvinistic
It does.
leaning in the translation.
and you can see it sometimes very,
Yeah, and if
very
you're-
clearly.
Yeah, that was one where it just popped right out there.
Yeah, I totally didn't catch that, but I think you're more sensitive to that. But when we stop seeking God, when we stop seeing God at work in creation, and we fail to taste His goodness, to taste and see His goodness, life becomes burdensome. And so the psalmist is telling you, if you want to see good, then this is your desire should be for God, and we see that in the context. So verses 13 and 14, David explains how we see good. And I love this because, okay, yeah, I want to see good, but how do I do it? So here's the life lesson. This is what makes it work. Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Now, we haven't got to the point yet in the story where we find out what happens with Doeg. That's going to come up later, but we find out that Doeg takes what he sees and he goes back and reports to Saul. And
Mhm.
so he actually lies to Saul about what he saw. And so David is describing Doeg right here.
Okay.
So, and he's also describing himself in the second point, because the second point is turn away from evil and do good. David will talk about how he failed to do good in this moment with the priest, and that the fact that he turned away from evil. Doeg, he recognized Doeg as Saul's servant, but he didn't do good. He did evil. So
And it cost the priest his life.
exactly. And so, and he could also be referring to the fact that, hey, I lied to the priest and I put the priest in a really bad situation because I did lie to him. And that was wrong of me. So we should take that into account. But then the third step he gives is to seek peace and pursue it. We aren't supposed to be content with just, oh, I hope I have a peaceful day here. No, we're supposed to be looking for peace. And again, that's not absence of conflict. I think so often Christians want peace, and we think, I just don't want any drama. I don't want any crisis. I don't want to have to stand up against anyone. That's not what David's saying. He's saying we should be seeking wholeness in our own lives and the lives of those around us. And sometimes that involves conflict.
Well, yeah, and and if you're because to me it's like if you're just wanting to not have conflict, then you're seeking happiness,
right?
And you're not seeking purpose. And where that sense of shalom and wholeness, you kind of get a sense of purpose in there.
Yes.
And it's not just about, oh, I can skate through my days without having to get frustrated by anything.
Where's my beach with my little umbrella drinks?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't get me wrong. That sounds like a great thing to do. But at the same time, how many people am I really helping? Am I promoting that wholeness in my community?
Right.
If that's what I'm seeking for myself.
And there's a time to rest on the beach with umbrella drinks.
Right.
Right.
But I hope so. That's
for
tasting and seeing.
There's a season. But yeah, I'm not condemning anyone who goes to the beach and drinks umbrella drinks. But if that's the goal of your life,
that's all you want.
Yeah.
No, I think actually in this, the idea is that you take everyone in your community and go to the beach and find, but
so after COVID, if there's anyone who wants to finance that, we will
have a Raven Creek retreat.
I'm not up for a cruise.
No, I don't want to be stuck on a boat with people I may not know. Sorry, I might love all of you. I might not. I don't know. But yeah, but that's what makes this psalm so interesting, is because David, at the point where this is being written about, he is alone. He's lied to the priest. He's endangered the lives of the priest. He saw evil and he turned away from it, but he didn't do good. And so the rabbis see this psalm as David's confession, him renouncing his acts at this time and saying, I messed up. I should not have done this. I should have been better. I should have trusted in God and actually relied on his goodness. Instead, I tried to manipulate things my own way. And again, that's the rabbis reading into it with this background from Samuel. Can we see that much there? I don't know if I can definitively go, absolutely, that's what David's doing here, but I think we can see hints. And sometimes that's all we get.
Yeah.
And so verse 15, the eyes of the Lord are turned toward the righteous. And in verse 17, we hear that when the righteous cries for help, the Lord hears. And so we don't have David being righteous yet in the story, but there is going to come a point where there is going to be this little glimmer of righteousness that we see in the story, because in David's flight, during the middle of it all, he remembers his aging parents. And despite the threat to himself, he goes and he gets them and he takes them to a safe place, or what he hopes will be a safe place. And we're going to talk about what that, whether it was or not. But taking care of your parents is an act of righteousness. And, recognizing that his parents, weren't going to be comfortable in a cave. This is a good son. I hope my daughter does as well. But notice the language he uses when he talks about the righteousness, the eyes of the Lord, the face of the Lord hears. I mean, these are all ideas of God being close, of being very near, this intimate relationship. And what happens when David takes care of his parents, that's when the prophet Gad shows up and speaks, when God tells him through Gad, this is what you need to do. This is the next step. And so the rabbis believe this is what David's referring to here. But he doesn't leave us with this kind of pie in the sky, oh, look, follow this theology and this formula and everything's going to be okay. He actually, he's very realistic with his faith. And that's one of the things I do love about David, is when you read his Psalms, They aren't just, hey, everything's grand and wonderful because God loves me and I followed the 3 steps in the latest self-help book that had Jesus' name in it,
Mhm.
It
The latest Christian caricature building book.
yeah, pretty much. Exactly. And David's not like that. I mean, when you read his Psalms, you can tell he's really wrestling with the real world issues of his time and he's wrestling with himself. And that's the other thing that I love about him is he's talking about, yeah, the enemies do this and this and it cost me that, but this is my heart and my heart this is what I'm feeling and he always looks inward to try to figure out what's wrong with him even in the middle of trying to work out with what he should do about his enemies. So in verse 19 he says, many are the afflictions of the righteous. Now somebody used to tell this to some of these prosperity gospel preachers that tell you that if you do all the right things, everything's going to be great. David, right here, many are the afflictions of the righteous. So maybe if you aren't afflicted, you aren't righteous. Just a thought.
Well, and the verse before that, where is it?
18.
I'm using two different Bibles, so I keep that are the verses are lined up differently. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and those with those crushed in spirit, He delivers. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean that if you're having a great week, you have to stir up a bunch of brokenness and put on a show in order to have praised or worshiped the Lord.
Right. Sometimes
we can just be thankful.
Yes.
Sometimes we can have a good time worshiping the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it. You've probably seen it. And it's like this formula that you go through at a lot of church services. You have your opener, big bass booming drum. Then you go through a couple, and then you kind of slow it down. You have the song that's oh, I'm such a terrible person. Woe is me. All this, and it's like it's the stirring up of this just fake
manufactured
brokenness and I know I'm going off on my own like little tirade here, but it's one of my big pet peeves that it's sometimes we can actually just come together and celebrate the goodness of the Lord.
Yeah.
And that's okay. That doesn't mean you're not doing everything right. It doesn't mean, because it's not like you're saving yourself anyway.
Right.
That's God's job.
Exactly.
But let's actually be happy about it on occasion. And I'm not saying you should always just have happy, upbeat church services.
Right.
Absolutely not. There's a time. There's a season. There are times when maybe you need to enter into some of those more broken places in your worship in your personal day to day, as opposed to making sure we stir it up during the weekend and get our fix or whatever you want to call it.
While you're talking, I'm wondering is how many times do we rob people of the opportunity for true repentance whenever we create it for them every week?
Yeah.
I mean, and if we can just feel it in kind of this kind of esoteric, detached way because it's just in the environment we've created and it's not personal, are we really letting people repent or encouraging people to repent of what they've actually done in their personal lives? And I'm just throwing it out there. I'm not for sure. Because, I think there's times, like you said, that we need to be okay with just being happy. And I think, we kind of came from the guilt and shame side of Christianity in a lot of ways. And
I struggle with it. I really do. I'm not saying that I've got this down.
Right.
But I'm saying that whenever we work it into our formula, it's that we just I was about to make a really obscure movie reference, but I don't know if anyone else is going to get it. But we sit around and we don't literally hit ourselves with whips, but we do it with the music.
Oh yeah.
And that's
and there is a time for corporate mourning and corporate grief and to gather together and to say, yeah, we are broken as a community. And there's something to that. And I think that's very biblical. But at the same time, like you said, if that's all we're doing, are we honoring the goodness of the Lord?
Right. There comes a time to admit that God made creation good. he and
Yeah.
and there's a time to admit that he's making us a new creation, or that he has made us a new creation, or we're in process. I don't know exactly how all that works.
Well,
I'm not
but
going to try to build a timeline for sanctification and justification and all that stuff right now. It's
thankfully God has it under control and we can trust him with it.
yeah, and his ways are not our ways, thankfully. So we don't
But
have to understand his thoughts completely.
But that ties us back into Rosh Chodesh and that celebration. That's part of the reason why this is read here is that there's the seasons, and it is that progressive move where David, just like I said before, as a king, he waxed and waned in greatness because sometimes he reflected God's glory more fully than he reflected it at other times.
Mhm.
And sometimes we, in our personal life, we reflect God's glory very well. I mean, for me, it's about 2 seconds at a time every 7 months, or if I'm lucky. Uh, but then there are times when we don't. And so, but the point of Rosh Chodesh is that there's going to be that renewal, and that we can always anticipate, just like the moon always returns. As long as we're turning back to God in repentance, then there is going to be that renewal, and not to forget that in that renewal we should celebrate the beauty.
Mhm.
And so that, like I said, that's why this psalm is read during that time. And David, I think he's capturing very well the cycle of, hey, things have gone wrong, and a lot of his psalms really do. Things have gone wrong.
Mhm.
People have hurt me. I've been a miserable person. I haven't handled things right. But God is faithful. God is faithful, and that's the point. God is faithful,
Mhm.
and we have to hang on to that. Not only is He faithful, He's good. And I think so often, because we haven't been taught the fear of the Lord,
Mhm.
and to have that awe, we've just operated from that place. I didn't think about this earlier, but one of the examples that just sprung to mind is, we had a dog that Dad got. You remember JJ, the Sheltie,
Oh yeah,
and
yep.
he was. Oh, we got him. He was such a mess. Shelties just have such long fur, and it was all matted.
Mhm.
Well, he had been abused before he came to live with us, and I basically took him over and I started brushing him out. And when we would start out this process, this dog would lose his mind. And I had bite marks all up and down my arms.
Mhm.
But I was determined. And I stuck with this dog every day, and we would brush and brush. And each time I just, maybe get a 6-inch patch of fur.
Mhm. Mhm.
And as the weeks progressed and the months went by, that dog learned that he didn't have to fear me in that, oh, she's going to beat me, she's going to hurt me
Right.
kind of way. And it got to the point, but before he died, if I would pick up a hairbrush to brush my hair, he would flop down on the side,
Yeah.
waiting to be brushed. And he had to be taught. And I'm not saying that we're like dogs, but there is that kind of similarity that sometimes the fear we have, we got it from the wrong place.
Right. Right.
And we have to work to overcome it, and hopefully we've got somebody who will teach us. And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
for those of us who aren't involved in that kind of, God is this huge taskmaster, we need to be teaching others. So
Mhm.
there's kind of
Mhm.
that implied command, and that's how we remain part of the community, is that we learn from each other and we teach each other. But verse 20, it's a curious verse. He keeps all his bones, and not one of them are broken. It's like out of the blue, all of a sudden we've got this reference um, to a skeleton. I mean, what in the world? But I think what David's trying to say here is, this is a God who's so close. We've gone through that face and the eyes and the ears, but God is so close that he's protecting so thoroughly that it goes down through the skin and through the muscle, and even to the core of our being is being protected, that we aren't subject to being harmed when God is that close to us. And how do we stay close to God? Well, it's by fearing him, by doing the things that he's asked us to do, and by humbling ourselves when we've messed up. And so there's it's just interesting that David, in this time that we've been taught that God was just, he was so far away and he wasn't intimately involved in the lives of people on a day-to-day basis. And we've kind of got this idea of the Old Testament God being that far distant God. Here's David saying the exact opposite. And he's coming against all of our preconceived notions of who this Old Testament God is. This is a God who cares about your bones. And and then you think about David being on the run and him being in those rocky hills and in the caves and in the cracks and the crevices between the rocks. Broken bones were a big deal.
Yeah, well, and back in the day, that was a fatal injury.
Right.
I mean, a broken arm or broken leg, especially if you're by yourself.
Yeah, forget it. I mean, I was actually reading something on Facebook the other day, and it would talk to. Wish I could remember the name of the woman who gave the presentation, but she was talking about the first signs of civilization, and by her estimation, she saw the first signs of civilization as a limb that had been broken, set, and healed. And she said this tells her that even in those ancient times, someone cared enough to take care of this person who could not function on their own. And they brought them food, and made sure that they had something to eat and were protected from the elements or the wild beast. And how amazing it is that we as humanity will take care of each other.
Yeah.
And so
Now, I do have another question about this.
Okay.
Because it does say that, where is it? Of course, I set it down and lose it.
Don't do that.
It says the face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. Now, is the question I have here, does this have anything to do with remembering your ancestors and burial practices? Because you would put someone in the cave until their bones, all that was left were bones, and then you'd gather them up and bury them later.
Oh man, you're gonna make me
I'm really
lie.
curious if there's something to that.
Which verse is that? Because you read it at the JPS, didn't you?
Yes. 16.
Okay, yeah. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil and cut off the memory of them from the earth. Oh, I have no idea. Actually, where my mind goes to at the beginning is the Rephaim and the Nephilim, and it's kind of interesting that it seems like their memory was almost cut off for a long period of time, and it's only been recently that scholars have been taking their existence. But of course, that goes back to ancestor worship. That's part of why they worshipped, because the demons were the disembodied spirits. And so now we have evidence that grandma's still hanging around, years.
Yeah. So, I mean, that kind of, I'm curious about that, because I do know that how they treated the dead was very specific, and it did revolve around the skeletons.
I am like, there are so many implications with what you just said that I would have to play with, because ancestor worship was a huge deal because there was power in it. And when you realize that these ancestors they were worshiping were hybrid supernatural human beings, then suddenly it makes sense on a whole different level than what, it wasn't just people being silly.
Right.
And so, that's some good speculation. Okay, well, somebody needs to make a note of that so we can come back to that later in a wrap-up episode or something. I'm going to go ahead and go on with my notes because I know I'm talking about. So
fair enough. That was just a question. I'm curious. That was
no. I mean, I'm curious too. Now, I actually made a note of verse 21, the difference between the ESV and my Art Scroll. So it might be interesting to see what the JPS does, because even though the Art Scroll is a Jewish translation, it's not the same as the JPS.
Sure.
So the verse 21, I've got affliction will slay the wicked. That's ESV. The death blow of the wicked is evil, according to the Art Scroll.
One misfortune is the death blow of the wicked. The foes of the righteous shall be ruined.
Okay. So basically, this is the evil that wicked men will do is going to come back on them, and they're going to reap what they sow. I mean, so this is an ongoing biblical principle that, you do good, expect good. God doesn't even have to do anything because the people have done it to themselves, is what he's saying. That God doesn't even have to exact justice because the providential design of the earth is that the evil comes back on them themselves, and because this is the method and means that that God uses, and the rabbis say that this is a reference to David not slaying Saul. He didn't have to slay Saul. He didn't have to enact God's justice on his behalf. Saul's own hubris is what gets him into trouble. And so David is able to watch, and God is able to watch as the events unfold that Saul actually put into motion himself.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of see that. I do find it interesting that it says one misfortune is the death blow to the wicked.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes me wonder if maybe it's the people who, like we talked about Jacob and Esau, the people who are short-sighted versus someone who
Has
has a
vision.
vision for the future. That if you don't have a vision for the future, if your goal is just happiness and one thing gets in your way, your whole day is ruined, or you haven't stored up for the winter, then you have a hard winter and then you're done.
Yeah, I think they were translating it that way because the word there is in the singular. It's interesting. It's in the feminine singular. Um,
Hmm.
So that's interesting. That it could be, it could be just that one thing. I mean, but we're back to the grasshopper and the ant.
Right,
I
right.
it's, and I think that's the really interesting thing about the Bible is we see so much truth that's woven through that's not simply isolated to the Bible, and this is part of what helps it be of impact into societies that aren't just Jewish, they aren't just Christian. It's that you can look at these truths and you can see that they're universal, but then you get to see where God steps in and he makes them so radically new and deeper and more meaningful. And you get to participate in the fulfillment of these things. And that it's a beautiful thing. So verse 22, the Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. Now, of course, David's on the run. He's taking refuge in the rock. David, he wrote this at the most uncertain time of his life. And for him to say this it's mind-blowing because think about the journey he's been on to this point. He has gone from being a shepherd who lived in these hills, who took care of the sheep, and he was the forgotten brother at the family feast. He went from being nobody to being a heartbeat away from that throne that he saw every single day. He's married to the king's daughter. Under A&E tradition, the son-in-law very likely could inhabit the throne. Everything was lining up for, it just had to fall into place. He needed one more thing. He just needed Saul to die. But it's the truth. And,
Details.
Yeah, details. But the thing is, it's all ripped away in a second. And he goes right back. He's not just even back where he started. He's further behind than when he started.
Yeah, now he's in the land of the enemy.
Yes.
He's not even in the right place, right country anymore.
Having to beg for weaponry, having to beg for bread. I mean, at least when he showed up with Goliath from watching the sheep, he had the sling with him.
Sure.
And so he was better prepared for his future at that point in time than now.
I always wonder what happened with that. Like, did he just give up the sling? I mean, it seemed a pretty effective weapon.
Right? Who knows? But I was thinking about this whole cycle. And how often is it that people, they get so close to what they believe God has called them to, this vision that God has given them, and it can even be the right vision. And then everything falls apart. And that's the moment they lose their faith. That's the moment that it all falls, they fall apart and they're shattered and they don't feel like they can ever trust God again because, all he had to do was this one thing, and everything would have been perfect.
Right.
And God chose not to, or the people around them were allowed to do something that was contrary. And now, it could be that church plant. It could be the great missionary event. It could be whatever. And they become so disillusioned with reality that they can't even function. And so for David to be in the middle of the situation and to make these claims about God, I mean, he had every excuse to give up on God. I mean, he had no reason to to hang on to his faith at this point. And we're not even told why he hangs on to his faith. Even in the psalm, there's no clue or indication given. And so now you understand, okay, that temptation to lie to the priest, the temptation to run to the Philistines, God's enemies, for protection, all of this makes sense. Because I have seen people today who've done the equivalent of this act.
Oh, yeah.
And we will condemn David for it, and we won't recognize how guilty we are in our own life. I've probably done the same thing in some metaphorical way. I just didn't take time because I didn't want to know. So, I mean, I'll be honest. But, he remembers, and he remembers his obligations to his parents in the middle of this because that is the right thing. And it was just that one little sliver of obedience, that one little glimpse of, hey, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm going to do the right thing, even though it puts me in danger because I love my folks. This is when God steps in and says, okay, here's your next step.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, the next step isn't a glamorous next step. It's not even a step that looks like it gets David any closer to being the king of Israel. It's just the next step.
Mm-hmm.
And so David has to walk in faith in that moment. And he picks up on that move of God towards him, and his faith is renewed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where a lot of us, when God moves towards us with that little glimmer, instead of going, hey, okay, I can see where we're going, God, we go, this doesn't make sense to me. That can't possibly be God. And we stop and we just kill off a little bit more of our faith.
Right.
And I think this is why David is so impressive. And I think this is why the ancients did love him so much. It's not that he's perfect. It's the fact that despite all this, he continues and continues to say, I can't see a way forward, but I'm going to trust God to make one. And then God comes through.
Well, yeah. And that's actually, and that kind of dovetails with what we talked about. I don't remember exactly when, but we talked about it sometime where there's a large portion of where people screw up in the Old Testament is that failing imagination, that they think, I can't see a way out. So this is the only way I can see it. So if God's going to do it, he's got to do it this way. And then God says, no, that's not the way it's going to be done. And then they're like, oh, well, of course, there's another way that I didn't see because God's bigger than our imagination.
Well, and I think we see David's imagination failing when he goes to Nov and when he goes to Gath, and we see him going, this is the only way I see. But then there's that, like I said, that moment.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's all we need. If we can just find that moment in our life where we can grab hold of the truth of God's promises and actually act on faith instead of being overwhelmed by our circumstances. And, not to sound preachy, I know it's probably too late, but, we have to remind ourselves of the truth of who God is. And this is why it's important we stay in the Word. This is why it's important we are in that community. We need people in the community to speak truth over us. We need people in the community to speak truth to. It's not just about receiving, it's also about giving. And we also need to trust that and have faith in who God says we are. And he says that he loves us. He says that he redeems us. He says he has plans and purposes for us. All of these promises that seems just so out there, we have to believe that they're true. And when we surrender that, because our current circumstances don't reflect this truth, we instead of going, circumstances are subject to God's rule, we turn around and we say, God's a liar. And that includes, I know, I'm getting ready to step out here where I probably shouldn't. The moment we start saying, hey, I'm just a horrible, sinful creature, even though we have repented and we've turned to God, and he says, you're my redeemed, you're my loved ones. So we have to accept that. We have to believe that. And so, it is that tension between I'm a horrible person who can screw up sometime and I am a child of the King. And we have to hold both those things in tensions. Now, here's the deal. A lot of us want to say, I'm just a horrible person, so I've got to manufacture the drama you were talking about. Right. And then some of us want to go, oh, well, I'm just a child of the King, so I can do no wrong.
Right. Yeah.
So, no. And it is finding that balance. But I guess I've been having a lot of conversations lately with people who
Or falling in one of those ditches.
Yeah, and a lot of people who don't want to accept that what God says about being his child and being loved is equally true as needing to repent and needing to seek salvation. So you can't have faith in one and not have faith in the other.
Right.
So that they're both true simultaneously. And if you don't believe both those things, then you are going to wind up in those ditches, and it's awful hard to dig your way out sometimes.
Yep.
Which, again, why you need community, because we pull each other out.
Yep.
So
exactly.
Anyway.
Well, cool. Well, that sounds like a good place to break. So everyone, if you want to be part of the conversation, Raven Creek SC on all the social media, ravencreeksc.com to the website. Let us know what you're thinking, and hit us up on iTunes. Give us a review and a rating. And don't forget to hit subscribe, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.